How many times do you wear an item of clothing before letting it go? Can old clothing be recycled into new? Is renting clothing the secret to solving our craving for new style without destroying the environment? All of this and more on today's episode of The Secret Life of Numbers. Welcome to the Secret Life of Numbers podcast, the podcast where we dissect everyday numbers and statistics to find the stories behind them.
Each episode, we take a number or statistic and break it down. We will tell you where it comes from and what it means for you. Along the way, hopefully we will inspire you to think about the numbers in your own life.
I'm Levannia, your data scientist on call. I'll be breaking down the numbers.
I'm Lindsay, your data translator, for when Levannia gets too technical on us. I'll be breaking down the rest.
All right, let's jump in. Lindsay, today we're talking about something that is very personal and important to both of us.
It's kind of a big topic, but I feel like it's on a lot of people's minds, and that is fast fashion.
Yes. I said it was personal because I love fashion, but then I also have to reconcile with the fact that it does contribute to greenhouse gas emissions.
It's an uncomfortable truth, but we need to acknowledge it. So I guess that takes us to our number for this episode, which is that on average, a piece of clothing is worn 7 times before it is discarded.
That doesn't seem like a lot. How did we get this number?
Okay, this number, we can't verify it. We could not find the original report. So where this came from was, I think this might be a market research. Barley Communications and Barnados teamed up with Census-wide to look into fashion behaviors and clothing purchasing behaviors of people in the UK. So they surveyed 2,000 people 16 years or older. And on the website where they talk about this report, they had a few different numbers of how much people spent and all that sort of stuff. But the 7 times number was not on there. But then this report was picked up by a lot of media outlets like The Guardian, et cetera, et cetera. And they all fixated on the 7 times. So it could be a real number. It might not be. And obviously it'd be an average.
Yes. Then we would have questions about whether or not the people that they sampled are an accurate representation of the population. Is it a random sample? All of those questions.
Well, and also, is this them being how many times do you think you wore this? Because I probably couldn't give you any accurate numbers for things that I own, except for special occasion outfits.
But I guess this number, whether it's 7 or whether it's more or less, it's kind of indicative of this trend that we now have in fashion called fast fashion.
Exactly. So the number is really just a jumping off point, and because we can't find the original report, we can't go into it. We'll just treat it as our launch point.
Yes. It is important to understand where your numbers come from, but sometimes you have initial studies that give you information about where you should look. Perhaps this is how we want to treat this market research. It's saying that perhaps we're not using clothes as much as we should or we think we are. Why is that?
And I think a good place to start is, why don't we define what fast fashion is? Because it's thrown around a lot, but rarely do I hear a definition.
I don't know if there's a standard definition for what fast fashion is, but I pulled this definition that I'm going to give you from a paper that I read in Nature Review. And they describe fast fashion as the drastic increase in textile production and fashion consumption. And it's a business model based on offering consumers frequent novelty in the form of low-price, trend-led products. Fast fashion relies on recurring consumption and impulse buying, instilling a sense of urgency when purchasing.
I feel called out. Just this weekend, I was at the Patagonia store, and there was this jacket that was 50% off, and I don't need another jacket. I don't have one exactly like it, but ones for similar temperatures. but it was like blue, and I love the color blue, and it was my size. Patagonia isn't really fast fashion. They're actually a certified B Corp and do quite a bit with making sure that their workers are paid a fair wage. But I was still like, but it's on sale. There's only one of them. It won't be here next time. I didn't end up buying it, though, so I'm quite proud of myself.
Oh, I'm proud of you. That is indicative of how we kind of feel about clothes. We almost view them as, I don't want to use the word disposable. Well, I guess that is what this definition is, in a sense, saying. When the fashion is fast, it is also disposable.
Yes, when it's very trendy and in a year, it'll look like it's out of style.
Yeah, and I think also the thing about fast fashion is it's not meant to last either. It falls apart very quickly, it breaks down very quickly. It can only go through your washing machine a few times.
And also, fast fashion relies on a low price because what they're going for is volume. And that also means that, let's just be honest, if a t-shirt costs $10, someone is not getting paid enough to make that.
Yes, that's true. There's a little bit more description of what fast fashion is in this paper. So they're saying that fast fashion is driven by consumption and efficiency. The rising consumption and efficiency in production of fashion products has driven the price of clothing very low. Despite an increase in the number of items owned that a person has, the amount that they're spending on clothing is less.
That's very interesting. I came across a stat that back in the 1950s, people spent 10% of their income on wardrobe. And it's because each item cost more, but they weren't buying that much clothing because, it was pricey to buy a pair of jeans. It was expensive to buy a jacket. And you bought one and you kept it and you mended it. And fast fashion is the complete opposite of that.
Yeah, fast fashion kind of facilitates this model where you're buying more at a lower price. And because you own more, you're obviously wearing it less.
Oh, that is such an elegant, summary of what the problem is. And it ties very nicely into our number.
That's fast fashion. And I guess fashion on a whole, if you're thinking about its environmental impacts and the way we address fabric and clothing, it has many ways in which it hits greenhouse gas emissions.
Because clothing is not just the item. It's the raw materials, the manufacturing, the processing, the shipping, the logistics, the consumption, the end of the life cycle. It's the whole gamut of so many industries.
I think this Nature review paper put it quite eloquently. They say that the environmental impacts of the fashion industry are widespread and substantial. So this is a direct quote. For example, although there is a range of estimates, the industry produces 8 to 10% of global CO2 emissions, which is 4 to 5 billion tons annually. The fashion industry is also a major consumer of water, 79 trillion liters per year, responsible for approximately 20% of industrial water pollution from textile treatment and dyeing, contributes approximately 35%, which is 190,000 tons per year of oceanic primary microplastic pollution, and produces vast quantities of textile waste, greater than 92 million tons per year, much of which ends up in the landfill or burnt, including unsold product.
So I'm going to be honest. You know how when you're in the ocean and you're standing there and there's waves rolling in and you get knocked down by one and then you try to get back up and then you get hit by the next wave and you're just kind of
Is that how you felt while I was reading that to you?
Yeah, it's oh my goodness, that many tons. Oh my gosh, that much water. Oh no, it's unsold, it's burnt. It's overwhelming. The problem is overwhelming.
8 to 10% of global CO2 emissions is not nothing, but it's quite complicated. This paper that I was reading, it kind of summarizes why fast fashion is difficult to quantify in terms of its environmental impact. We can briefly go through, but I don't know. I don't want it to be another wave rolling over you.
No, I think it's good because once we can identify that it is overwhelming, we can start breaking it down and looking for ways to improve things that we can do, things that we can do collectively. So why don't we go through those points?
Sure. So the first one is that the textile and fashion industry has a long and complex supply chain. starting from the agriculture, like if it's a natural fiber, for example, cotton, or if it's a petroleum-based product, to manufacturing, logistics, and retail, that entire supply chain is quite long and quite complicated.
It could probably be aptly described as dark and twisty.
Probably. And then each production step along the supply chain has an environmental impact due to the water, material, chemical, and energy use that it consumes. Many chemicals used in textile manufacturing are harmful for the environment, the factory workers who are making the products, as well as consumers. Most environmental impacts occur in the textile manufacturing and garment manufacturing countries, but textile waste is found globally. So even though waste is produced where you make the fabric, if it's unsold in another country, the waste is in two places. You need to measure it in two places. You need to quantify it in two places. Have to have similar measuring systems in those two places as well.
Yeah, and ways of quantifying it.
The last 2 points are about fast fashion. So they say that fast fashion has increased the material throughput in the system. Fashion brands are now producing almost twice the amount of clothing today compared with before the year 2000, which is surprising because 2000 was only 22 years ago.
Yeah.
And then current fashion consumption practices result in large amounts of textile waste, most of which is incinerated, landfilled, or exported to developing countries.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Is asking about textile recycling going to bring good news?
Well, okay, so textile recycling is interesting. I guess we should probably divide it into recycling and reuse. Reuse is when you donate it for someone else to wear or use. But recycling will actually break down the fibers for another purpose, perhaps.
Right. And sometimes things are stepped down, right? Downcycled.
So textile recycling, you can think of it as reprocessing either pre or post-consumer textile waste to use in textile products or non-textile products. So, for example, you could break down something and use it as stuffing for a toy. And that would be an example of downcycling because you're not making another piece of clothing with it.
Right. It would be circular if, you took a sock, sent it to be recycled, and then it became a sock again.
Yeah, or it became clothes again.
Yeah. But when you're stepping down to something else, the stuffing cannot be made into... anything's possible. Maybe there'll be a miracle in textile recycling innovation. But as of right now, the stuffing in a stuffed animal that's made out of recycled clothing is not going to be cycled back up to be clothing.
Yes. That type of textile is not at the same quality as what you use in your clothing, and it cannot be used to make clothing again.
Yeah. Okay.
There are different ways that textile recycling can happen. The most common one that I've researched is mechanical recycling. Mechanical recycling works through simply shredding the textile waste into short fibers, which lowers the quality. And then you can use that shredded material to make new materials. Then there's chemical recycling, which works by fractionating the fibers through a chemical dissolving process at a polymer level. And that can be suited for cellulose-based fibers. And then also thermal recycling, which is used for thermoplastics like polyester.
It's easy to forget sometimes that a lot of clothing is plastic.
Yes, so that kind of leads us to natural versus synthetic fibers. Your natural fibers are wool, cotton, linen, hemp, come from animals or plants. And then your synthetic fibers really come from oil or natural gas, like polyester, acrylic, rayon, spandex. And many of those synthetic fibers are difficult to recycle. So, for example, spandex, if it's going through this mechanical fiber recycling, will actually begin to melt.
Oh, no.
So it actually can't be recycled in this way.
That must be a huge problem then, because a lot of clothing is made of blends and composites. So a lot of clothing, even if it's 90% cotton, there's, 10% spandex to give the shirt a stretch or some comfort. So how do you de-spandex?
So I guess that's where some of these other methods would come in. It might be that you could thermally or chemically recycle.
Right.
But I'm guessing that would be more expensive.
And probably more challenging.
Yeah, because you'd have to like pull out the different types and then recycle them appropriately.
That's very challenging.
Yeah, so I guess that also kind of contributes to this whole process. Like you're making more of it, you're using it less, you can't recycle it effectively, so it's just creating a lot of waste and subsequently a lot of greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah. Okay, so we've talked about some of the challenges of recycling clothing, but how much clothing is actually recycled? I can't recall if there is anywhere that I've ever been able to drop off clothing to where it can be recycled.
These types of numbers are tracked, at least in the US, by the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. I could not find numbers on Statistics Canada, but we can go through the EPA numbers. So the EPA estimated the generation of textiles in 2018 was 17 million tons.
That's a lot. Oh my goodness.
Yes, that's a lot of textiles. But this is also generation for clothing and footwear as well. And that comes from the American Apparel and Footwear Association. And then the recycling rate that they found for textiles was 14.7% in 2018, which would account for 2.5 million tons recycled.
I have a question with this figure, and they might not have reported this, so it might not have been like something that we can speak to, but does that mean they're anticipating that the clothing purchased in 2018 has a life cycle of 1 year? Or is that just how much was recycled and then how much was produced, so they calculated the rate that way?
They use something called a mass balance approach. So they're like, given how much is generated and how much is recycled, they estimate how much is like landfilled. So they say here that they make adjustments for imports and exports and for diversions. And oh, yes, and then they also make adjustments for the lifetimes of the product. They say that industry data and state level data provide the basis of recovery through recycling and composting. And then they can calculate how much is discarded and makes it to the landfill, because that's the difference.
So that means the vast majority is going to the landfill.
Yes, there's a lot of textiles that end up in our landfills. And I think we talked about this in our plastics episode as well. Like, I don't think it's anyone's fault. We just don't have the system set up yet or methods that allow us to adequately recycle textiles.
Well, it's hard too, because I've been holding on to things, obviously are ready for a downcycling journey. Swimsuits where all the spandex is given out, or socks with holes in them. But I'm having trouble finding, where do I put them other than the garbage?
And that is something I'm struggling with as well. And I don't have an answer for you, because it sounds like the best place to put them would be the garbage. Because if you donate them and they're sorted out as being not usable, then they're just going to go to the landfill anyway. And then there's all the transportation cost. Or if they are recycled and they're not the right blend, perhaps, and they could create contamination. Sometimes it feels like an episode of The Good Place.
In what way?
Well, I mean, I don't know what choice is the right choice to make. It feels like there are no good choices when it comes to recycling my textiles.
I don't think there's a perfect answer. And, I think we do need more of those solutions. And we also need a way for people to know about them and to be easy and convenient. It shouldn't be this hard to have to think about, let me do some reading in the primary literature about the life cycle of a pair of pants so that I can determine what I should do with my jeans that have a slight rip in them.
Yes. I guess that leads us elegantly into your section about the world impact of fast fashion and some of these numbers.
So this does tie in really nicely, because I was very curious. There's all sorts of new, well, not new necessarily, but more popular alternatives now to buying new clothes, of buying secondhand or renting clothes. With companies like Rent the Runway, that's becoming more mainstream and accessible.
Mm-hmm. And
I was wondering, what is the best option here?
Yes.
Because each one is kind of presented with this like greenwashed view of, but you won't be requiring a new evening dress to be made each time you have a gala.
I'm very curious about this because I do purchase a lot of secondhand clothing, but I have never rented.
Same. I found a paper that was published in 2021 in the journal Environmental Research Letters that is titled Innovative Recycling or Extended Use, ? Comparing the global warming potential of different ownership and end-of-life scenarios for textiles.
Sounds like what we need.
Yeah, it's not often you find exactly the paper you were looking for. What this study did is they did a life cycle analysis of what they called the global warming potential, which can be thought of as like the emissions associated with each scenario. And they looked at 5 different ownership and end-of-life scenarios for creating and using a single pair of jeans.
Okay.
This is kind of like some of the other papers that we've gone through in different seasons where it's like, this is all theoretical, but using real numbers. So at some point, you have to start making assumptions of like, it's one pair of jeans, this is where it's made, this is what we do. So I'm going to run you through the assumptions.
Okay.
The geographical focus of this study is the EU. So it's assuming you buy the pants in the European Union. They did not account for water use, toxic chemical, and waste generation within the scope of this study. So that's a whole other bag of fish. Kettle of fish, I think is the saying.
Kettle of fish, bag of worms.
And they actually used ISO standards for their modeling. The time horizon was 100 years for the pair of jeans.
Okay. You buy the jeans in the EU, and you look at how much waste is generated in 100 years by the pair of jeans.
Yes.
And you don't look at, water waste?
Yeah, you don't look at water use, toxic chemical, or waste generation.
So I guess in a sense, this is really like the emissions over the life of the jeans.
Yes, and I'll go through the 5 points that they accounted for emissions. So I'll go through that. But first of all, they assumed that the jeans were used 200 times in each of the scenarios they'll describe.
So 200 wears.
200 wears. And they assumed that the jeans were washed once every 10 wears. So over the lifetime of jeans, they were washed 20 times.
That's obviously an average. But this is, I guess, the data we have.
This is the kettle of fish we're working in. And one thing they did account for was the electricity and heat of disposal, reuse, and of production of the textile fibers. What they did to determine the global warming potential is they looked at manufacturing. And here they had to assume a few other things. So Bangladesh is the leading exporter of jeans to the European Union. So they used that to estimate the global warming potential. And this manufacturing was included in all of the scenarios except for reduce, which their reduce scenario was that you just got a longer wear out of the jeans you already have.
Okay.
Which is kind of a limitation of it as well, because there are manufacturing emissions associated with creating the jeans in the first place, even if you wear them twice as long. Mm-hmm. So nothing's perfect. The next one was delivery. So jeans from Bangladesh take a 14,800 kilometer journey through the Suez Canal to land in Rotterdam, Netherlands. They travel in a global shipping container which runs on heavy oil from the EU. They assume that from the port in the Netherlands, the jeans travel 500 kilometers, a hop, a skip, and a jump, to the Central European market. And then they assume that a consumer drives 2 kilometers to buy the jeans.
Okay.
Use is the third part. And we already talked about that. That's where they account for washing. And then end-of-life processes, there's a few different ones. So incineration, recycling, and they assumed that the jeans are transported 100 kilometers during that to reach its final destination.
This is, I guess, the world in which they've created for the life of these jeans that we're going to look at.
Yes, this is the sisterhood of the traveling pants. So let's walk through the scenarios. The first one is, they call it the base, which is just like basic use, and then you dispose of it in a waste-to-energy facility. So you wear them 200 times, they're done, you discard them essentially. The second one is reduce, which we already talked about. Basically, you wear the jeans 400 times instead of 200. So you get more use out of it.
And then you send them directly to waste.
And the assumption of this, which is also its kind of limitation, is that no burden from the original purchase of the jeans is allocated to this scenario. The third one is reuse. So that's reselling. So selling clothes secondhand, like selling them on Poshmark or Facebook Marketplace or a thrift store, and they get a new life.
Okay.
The fourth one is recycling. So that's what you kind of got into, which was the industrial processing of new materials. One of the issues is that there's really higher overall emissions to recycle than to initially produce a pair of jeans, because the emissions associated with cotton are lower based on their analysis than how to recycle jeans. So this one's kind of rough because the intention is there, but in reality, it doesn't actually work.
Which kind of speaks to what we were saying before with recycling textiles is incredibly difficult, and we don't necessarily have the techniques that we need yet.
Yes. The final scenario, which is the one that I think we're kind of the most curious about, is they called share. So that's renting clothes. Now that we've gone over the 5, I was wondering if you want to take a guess at like which one's the best and which one's the worst.
Okay. So is share like it's just 200 wares, but like each one is a different person?
They did have a few different scenarios for share where they broke down like how many times it's worn by each person, like how it's transported, how people pick it up. So we can go into that, but there's like a subgroup analysis of different assumptions in there. I can't give you a perfect answer.
Okay, but it's still like 200 uses and not all the same person.
Yeah, so it's been traveling for the uses.
Okay, so I think probably like the first or second, like just using in landfilling or using for twice as long in landfilling would probably have like lowest potential. Or like maybe even the reuse option, but then there's more transportation cost.
So the extended use, the reduce, like what you talked about, like just wearing it for longer is the best. But if you account for the initial global warming potential of creating the pair of jeans in the first place, it becomes on par with the second best option, which is the reselling.
Okay.
And do you want to guess who's the big bad wolf of the clothing industry?
Is it the renting?
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's great in theory, but the paper describes what they call the rebound effect, which their definition for that is when the resource efficiency gains caused by a new technology or organizational practice, so in this case, like the rental service, are not achieved or they remain in smaller than expected amounts for external reasons. If all the transportation was zero emissions, maybe it would make sense. But the dry cleaning, the traveling.
I guess if the grid was all electric, then there would be less fossil fuels used to transport the jeans.
And it also depends a lot on like how hard are the customers on the jeans, because like one of their scenarios was like, okay, let's say the jeans that are rented are used 400 times instead of 200. Like that really cuts down on the GWP or the
global warming potential.
You got it. But does that mean it's sent out more to more people? And does that cancel out the gains of wearing it longer because you're transporting it more?
I'm kind of conflicted about these results. For example, like the best 2 options would be wearing it for 400 times or reselling it. But what if after you wear it for 200 times and you resell it, it's like not in a state that someone would want to buy it?
Well, that's the huge problem with fast fashion is like it's not designed to last. So it's even kind of worse than projections because we are assuming that it does get that use and that it is okay for the next 200 wears after already having 200 for 400 total, and that just might not be the case.
My experiences with buying used clothing is that they basically look new when you purchase them. And many of these reuse stores will not take your clothing for consignment, for example, if it doesn't look almost new.
Especially with consignment. They're also kind of picky about brands sometimes, which I do understand.
Overall, what we're seeing is kind of this entire way in which we approach fashion needs to change.
Yeah. And I think that's hard because we already have these habits, and like it's hard because shopping is as much a social thing as it is productive at times. Like I know when we lived in the same city, we loved to like go downtown and you like have a nice dinner and you like look at all the shops and
yeah. maybe this leads us into a discussion about our own experiences with fashion and what we're doing or what we're not doing, or what we feel guilty about.
Do you want to kick us off or do you want me to start?
Sure. One of my New Year's resolutions this year was not to buy any new clothing. So if I was going to buy clothing, it would be used clothing. And that I would also think about how I dispose of my used clothing as well. Like I would be more conscious about my textiles. And that has proven to be a challenge because I have 3 weddings, like you who have 3 galas. So now I have to like get used clothing, but then you want it. Sometimes these like functions have dress codes, so you need to make sure it fits your dress code. And then you're also looking at like the availability in your used clothing stores, which is not always, I guess, designer clothing or like fancy clothing to go to galas. Because a lot of these stores, they're looking at resale value when they take in the clothing. And like not a lot of people go into those stores looking for fancy clothes. They just want like everyday wear.
Yeah, and it's hard too because let's say you didn't know ahead of time. Like you could easily go to the mall and get what you needed.
Yes.
But you can't easily go to multiple independent small consignment stores. And there's no guarantee there'll be a dress that you like or that even fits you.
Exactly. And that kind of, because I haven't been successful. I did purchase something new, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And it was that type of a situation because I had to go to a funeral and I was like, I need something to wear. And I don't necessarily have time to go to these consignment stores or to these reuse stores to find something. And the mall was like a 10-minute walk away.
And I don't think those are necessarily the scenarios we need to beat ourselves up about.
I mean, like, I know we talk about the difference between individual and systematic changes. We want to think about our individual actions becoming systematic changes. So I think if we all collectively, as like people who love fashion, move away from fast fashion, I think that will help us. And you can buy the new clothes every now and again, but if you just like avoid some of these like more greenhouse gas emitting practices like fast fashion.
I think too, even if you just bought one thing less, or when you see something you like, walk away from it and see if you still miss it in a week. Right? Or for me, I've even started making a lot of my own clothes because I've gotten really into knitting sweaters. I've learned a few things from that. So knitting your own clothes is probably the slowest fashion you can do because it takes forever.
Making each individual knot yourself.
Yeah, each stitch takes time. I think there's also overconsumption in knitting and in yarn because it's hard to buy exact quantities for what you're making. And it's easy to see like the latest pattern on Instagram that someone made and be like, I want to make that without reflecting on like, is that a style that I will find flattering? Like, do I like the pattern or did they just knit it in my favorite color? like those questions. And also I've had to really challenge myself to only make things that I think I'll actually wear. And to be more careful of what yarn I make them out of. Like I made the most gorgeous lamb's wool sweater. And let me tell you, I don't know if this is all lamb's wool or just the one I bought, but it was really itchy. Like I have to wear a turtleneck under it. And also lamb's wool is extremely warm. So that means that, you know, how many days out of the year can I realistically wear that sweater where it's cold enough to wear a lamb's wool sweater and a turtleneck? It's not easy.
Yeah, I think we talked about this, I guess, when we talked about the climate crisis. It seems like in terms of fashion, everything is definitely complicated and everything is connected.
Yes. I still think, though, knitting my own sweater is probably better than buying it.
I'm guessing you're going to wear it more than 7 times. And I'm guessing like this is something that it has like reuse value as well. Like you could probably pass it on to a friend.
Yeah.
Something that paper that I read talked about was that they said that like consumers must understand fashion as more of a functional product rather than entertainment and be ready to pay higher prices that account for the environmental impacts of fashion.
It's hard. And we're not talking about people who like can't afford to buy clothes other than fast fashion.
Yeah.
It's really something to look inwards. And I think for me too, the part that always gets me kind of beyond the environmental impact is knowing that you can't sell clothes at the prices that fast fashion sells without exploiting people.
Yes. I love fashion, and I feel like there's a way to appreciate it. You don't need to own a lot of it to appreciate it. I guess that leads us to our science seed, our favorite part of the episode.
Each episode, we like to give our listeners something to think about. A science nugget to help you think more critically about the numbers and statistics you hear every day. And the one for today is kind of short and sweet, which is that the most sustainable clothes are the ones you already own. I think a fun challenge as you go about getting dressed for the next few weeks is to just look at your closet and think about shopping your own closet.
Yeah.
Right? Like, how can you still recreate that experience if maybe you find something that you forgot you had and you can enjoy it or pass it along to someone who will?
Yeah, so I suppose a science seed as well as a call to action.
Yes. A little double whammy.
When purchasing clothing as well, think about the end of life, like that pre-cycling mentality as well. Like, well, how long will you use it? How will you dispose of it? And perhaps think about that or factor it into your decisions when you're purchasing. Thanks for listening, everyone. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you find your podcasts. You can find the references we used for this episode in our show notes. A special thank you to Julian Bertino, who does our sound editing and music.
If you like what you hear, please rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It really helps us reach new listeners. Have an idea of what we should cover next? Or want to know more about what we talked about today? Follow us on Instagram at The Secret Life of Numbers.
We'll catch you next time on The Secret Life of Numbers, where the numbers can run,
but they can't hide.